While many members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believe they have a religious obligation to support Israel, I'm not convinced. In fact, I'd argue that not only is supporting a free Palestine the right thing to do, it's also the only way to truly uphold the teachings of the Church. As a lifelong Mormon who's visited Palestine several times, my view on this conflict has evolved significantly over the years. So today I'll be talking about the history of the Church's connection to Israel, how supporting a free Palestine furthers Church mission, and introduce you to the unexpected but strong Mormon-Palestinian ties that already exist. So what's the history of the Mormon Church in the Holy Land? Turns out it goes pretty far back. In 1841, on the Mount of Olives to the west of the city of Jerusalem, Orson Hyde, an apostle of the Church, offered a dedicatory prayer. This prayer, among other things, called for the gathering of Judah's remnant, the building up of Jerusalem, and the creation of a temple. In the decades that followed, the idea of Zionism, or the creation of a Jewish homeland, gained traction and ultimately resulted in the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. Church members may point to that prayer by Hyde as evidence that the Zionist project is endorsed by God, church members, and the Church itself. But what does the Church actually believe? Well, to understand that, you need to actually know who I'm named after. My parents studied at Brigham Young University's Jerusalem Center, and that was one of the many things that bonded them together. So much so that when they had their first child, they named me after my late uncle, as well as Jerusalem Center educator David Galbraith. Galbraith directed the BYU Jerusalem Center for 15 years and was himself a scholar of the Middle East. In the 90s, David Galbraith wrote an article in the Church Ensign magazine reflecting on the 150-year anniversary of the dedication by Hyde. The article talks about the history of Hyde's trip, as well as the influence of the dedicatory prayer on the Jewish movement to the Holy Land. But Galbraith also noted in the article that the dedication is often confused by members as endorsement of Israel. Galbraith writes, "The scriptures and the modern prophets clearly teach that all Father Abraham's children have a place in the Lord's plan, and our Arab/Palestinian friends are a part of this group. Latter-day Saints need to be more sensitive to the hurt, disappointment, and even anger created among our Arab-Palestinian friends when we blindly attribute divine approbation to all that takes place in that part of the world we call the Holy Land." Former Church President Howard W. Hunter also disputed the idea that the Church favors the Israeli state.
Sometimes they are offended by members of the Church who give the impression that we favor only the aims of the Jew. The Church has an interest in all of Abraham's descendants. Do you imagine our Heavenly Father loving one nationality of His offspring more exclusively than another? Both the Jews and the Arabs are children of our Father. They are both children of promise. And as a church, we do not take sides. We have love for and an interest in each. The purpose of the gospel of Jesus Christ is to bring about love, unity, and brotherhood of the highest order.
More recently, statements in October 2023 by the First Presidency of the Church had an air of neutrality as it condemned violence in all forms. And in November of that year, the Church announced, quote, devotion of significant financial resources for relief efforts in Gaza and Israel. So the Church will position itself as neutral in this conflict. But that's not really the question you should be asking about Palestine. So how should we think about this issue? Let's start with a story from church history. In 1838, early church members at a settlement in Missouri known as Haun's Mill were attacked by a mob that killed 17 church members, including 3 boys who were shot at while they hid in a blacksmith room. It is the largest massacre of members of the church during that period and is often talked about with incredible soberness. As terrible as that incident was, let's take a look at perspective when we're talking about the suffering over the past 3 years in Gaza alone. UNICEF reports upwards of 50,000 children killed or injured by an army that has next to no accountability for its actions. In addition to indiscriminately killing children, the IDF has also murdered healthcare workers and over 200 journalists as of 2023. That is astounding. And I must emphasize, it's clear that many of these killings were intentional. As Christians, we cannot support this. So is this conduct a product of October 7th? As I've read on the history of the conflict, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. To put it bluntly, the nation-state of Israel is an expansive aggressor committing genocide against Palestinians both by execution and forced removal. Those Palestinians that do remain are subject to an apartheid style of governance, with Arabs treated as second-class citizens. They have different roads, they go through multiple checkpoints, as well as unequal application of the laws. I've seen those unequal systems with my own eyes. As I mentioned, my parents love the Holy Land. They've led tours to Israel and Palestine since the early 2000s up through 2020, and I've had the opportunity to go, and on the occasions that I've had, I'll never forget the things that I've witnessed. For example, in East Jerusalem, you'll notice more trash on the streets. When we asked our Arab co-guide about this, he explained the political roadblocks that make it difficult for contractors to have trash collection. There's sometimes police blockades that keep them out of neighborhoods. There's just unequal services being given to the Arab population in Israel. The pattern from the Nakba up to the present day shows a clear division in how Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel are treated. The atrocities committed by the Israeli governance alone are enough to abandon our support of that nation. But how can we reconcile that truth with beliefs of prophesied events? I don't believe those prophecies can be fulfilled under current Israeli governance. Among the things talked about in Hyde's prayer was the building up of Jerusalem. A city under constant military tension does not seem like a fulfillment of that prophecy. In addition, Hyde predicted the creation of a temple, assumingly one with LDS rights, which is not likely under the current ethno-state. The Israeli governance is not really known for its religious tolerance. Currently, Muslims are subject to indiscriminate closures of access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, one of the three holiest sites in Islam. Israeli police have also prevented Catholic leaders from celebrating Palm Sunday Mass in Jerusalem, and the government has disrupted and even destroyed other churches and mosques in the region. So those prophecies that Hyde talked about are more likely to be fulfilled under a secular democratic governance. But honestly, should we be concerned about our role of fulfillment in those prophecies? Consider, does fulfilling a prophecy absolve someone of wrongdoing? It's pretty clear that despite prophecies that Judas would betray Christ and that Jesus would be crucified by the Romans, that doesn't mean that those actions were condoned because they were prophesied. Ultimately, God doesn't want us to fulfill prophecies. He wants us to keep commandments, including caring for the most vulnerable of his children. But would a Palestinian state be more religiously tolerant? In a post-9/11 world, Western Islamophobia would make you believe that Muslims are hateful toward all other religions. But that's not true. And we've been admonished by President Hunter to build bonds between Muslims and Mormons.
A cabinet minister of Egypt once told me that if a bridge is ever built between Christianity and Islam, it must be built by the Mormon Church. In making inquiry as to the reason for his statement, I was impressed by his recitation to the similarities of the common bonds of brotherhood.
The several times that I've been to Israel and Palestine, our groups have been co-led by Arab Muslims. With visits to Muslim shops and Muslim holy sites, we were always treated with respect. The same cannot be said for our interaction with Israelis. Let me tell you about two different interactions in the same place at different times. In the occupied West Bank, there is a field outside of Bethlehem that BYU Center Jerusalem students have gone for years. They go there rather than being in a church to try and recreate the feeling of what it would be like to be in a field outside of Bethlehem, similar to the night when Christ was born. Those students have always been treated with respect by their Palestinian neighbors. The first time I went to the Holy Land in the early 2000s, our group visited these fields, and while there we came across local shepherds, Palestinian shepherds. They were kind enough to chat with us and even let us hold one of their lambs as we took photos. It was a true highlight of the trip to be outside of Bethlehem and think of the night of Jesus' birth and all the symbolism that that means for Christianity. But when I made my second visit in 2011, things had changed. A West Bank Israeli settlement, which is illegal under international law, had moved in to this Palestinian area. There they had terrorized their neighbors. And when we visited in 2011, some young adults bothered us. They threw rocks at our bus. They swore at me when I said hello, and intimidated our Arab bus driver and Arab co-guide simply for being there. Again, this is a place that's very important to my parents, but as a result of their treatment, they have not been back in any other trips. To protect their guests and our guides from violence from West Bank settlers. Another lie that you might have been told is that violence is inevitable between Jews, Muslims, and Christians. But history says that's simply not true. Did you know before the creation of Israel, there were Jews living in Palestine? They lived in relative peace with their Arab and Muslim neighbors for centuries. That historic presence of religious tolerance is still around today, though more in the minority. In Israel, there are groups of Jews that advocate for Palestinian rights, including the Standing Together movement in Israel, as well as Jewish Voices for Peace in America. These groups combat the idea that being anti-Israel is anti-Semitic. Jewish Voices for Peace have said in a statement that that conflation is dangerous. Everywhere in the world, Jews belong and should be safe. Real safety does not grow from guns, checkpoints, walls, and a police state. True safety is built through forging real solidarity with all those fighting for a more liberated world. The Israeli state even remains a threat to holy worship places. As you might know, the IDF bombed one of the oldest churches in the world in Gaza in 2023. The evidence is historically and today that the Palestinian people are more religiously tolerant than the government of Israel. We've talked a lot about Muslims, Jews, and other Christian denominations in the Holy Land, but did you know there are Palestinian Latter-day Saints in Israel? While most of the members of the small congregations of the church in Israel and Palestine are made up of foreign workers, there are Palestinian members of the church that face the same profiling and violence from settlers and the military as other Palestinians. Their stories are rarely highlighted in part due to safety reasons, but one of those members is a professor at BYU, Idaho, Sahar Kumsia. She wrote a book about her experience titled Peace for a Palestinian. Kumsia was raised in a Christian church in the West Bank, but received a scholarship at BYU, where she was baptized in Provo. After returning home to Palestine, she continued to attend church, but that became much more difficult as she had to cross checkpoints and wait hours at a time. Despite that, she continued to attend and even served as Relief Society president of her branch. Her story is incredible, and I highly recommend that you read her book, as she represents the small but faithful saints in Palestine. But do church institutions and members have other forms of solidarity with Palestinians? Well, the BYU Jerusalem Study Abroad Center does hire local Palestinians to do some work at the center. They also provide scholarships to Palestinians. How that came to be is a really fascinating story that I haven't seen told anywhere else online. When the church built the BYU Center in Jerusalem, they leased the land from the Israeli government. However, the church also approached the Palestinian landowners to offer a form of pavement to the family that had been forcibly removed from that land. Instead of asking for money, the landowners asked for scholarships for Palestinian students to Brigham Young University in Provo. That's continued ever since, and one of my good friends at BYU, Talal Sisalam, was one of those recipients of that scholarship. He's a rapper and an advocate for Palestine. Another Palestinian BYU alum is Hani El-Madhoun, a very successful man, vice president of UNRWA USA. Hani and his brother Mahmoud also founded the Gaza Soup Kitchen in 2024. That's a nonprofit that has operated feeding people as Israel has severely restricted the flow of food into Gaza. Hani was also a guest on the congressional floor of Representative Rashida Tlaib when they protested Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's speech in July of 2024. Over 150 of Hani's relatives have died since the recent genocide in Gaza. Among those dead include his brother Mahmoud, who was killed by a targeted IDF military strike in November of 2024. Let me repeat that. Ahmed El-Madhoun was murdered by the IDF after he began devoting himself full-time to feeding starving people in his home area of Gaza. Their foundation continues to feed Gazans, and you can find a link in the video below. They also have great merch, including the shirt I'm wearing. If you want some action you can take to help Palestinians with like-minded people, consider following Fasting for Gaza on Instagram. Our group applies the Mormon principle of fasting and prayer. You abstain from food for 24 hours. You use the money that you would have spent on food and give a generous charitable donation. We as a group organize fast and prayers with donations going to the Gaza Soup Kitchen. So both branches of church institutions and members have existing forms of solidarity with Palestinians. So despite what you have been told or may have previously believed, there are ample reasons to support the Free Palestine movement as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I hope we can adopt the mantra of Hymn 237 and do what is right, let the consequence follow. I'm David Boyle. If you enjoy this content, here's another video for you. Consider subscribing on YouTube and supporting the Patreon.